Panjshir Valley, Afghanistan, September 1986. 02:17 hours. The night is absolute. A deep mountain cold seeps into the steel of a Soviet T-62 main battle tank, parked as a sentinel on a barren ridge. Inside, the world is a ghostly green. The gunner, Senior Sergeant Alexei Vasev, presses his face against the rubber eyepiece of his 1PN22M image intensifier. The landscape materializes in a shimmering monochrome haze. He scans the blackness of the valley floor, a river of ink between jagged cliffs. He sees rocks, shadows, the faint outline of a long-destroyed village. Nothing moves. The only sound is the low hum of the tank's systems and the static hiss in his headset. "All clear, Comrade Lieutenant," Vasev reports, his voice a dry whisper. 2 kilometers away, on a reverse slope no Soviet map accurately charts, a different kind of eyepiece is active. A Mujahid commander, his face lit by the soft glow of a small screen, watches a column of 4 Soviet BTR-60 armoured personnel carriers rumbling along the valley road. He sees them not as shapes, but as brilliant white silhouettes against a cold, dark blue background. Their engine blocks blaze like torches. The heat of their exhaust fumes paints swirling plumes in the air. He sees the faint, warm outlines of the crew inside the lead vehicle. He is not using starlight. He is seeing heat itself. The system is an AN-TAS-4 thermal sight, mated to an American-supplied TOW anti-tank missile. He aligns the crosshairs, the system emitting no visible light, giving no warning. He breathes out and depresses the trigger. On the ridge, Vasev's green-tinted world erupts in a flash of blinding white light. The lead BTR vanishes in a fireball that casts stark, terrible shadows across the valley. Before the echo of the first explosion fades, a second missile streaks from the darkness. A precise, unforgiving line of death. Then a third. The Soviet convoy, blind on its own side, is methodically dismantled in total darkness. Vasev frantically traverses his turret, searching the void where the missiles originated. He sees nothing but black. A primal, technical horror dawns in the pit of his stomach. The enemy is not just hiding in the night, they own it. The stage is set for a conflict where technological shock would become as decisive as any battle. To understand how American thermal vision came to haunt Soviet tankers in the mountains of Afghanistan, we must first journey back to the very beginning, to the political earthquake that triggered the invasion. To comprehend the technological shockwave that would reverberate through the Panjshir Valley, one must first understand the geopolitical fault line that brought the Soviet war machine to Afghanistan. The year is 1978. The Cold War is a global chessboard, locked in a tense, binary stalemate. In April of that year, a pro-Soviet Marxist party, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, seizes power in a violent coup known as the Sour Revolution. The new government, led by Nur Mohammad Taraki, immediately launches a radical, brutal modernization campaign. Land redistribution, forced literacy, the abolition of bride price, and the promotion of women's rights. In the deeply conservative, tribal and Islamic rural society of Afghanistan, these decrees are not seen as progress. They are seen as a direct assault on 1,000 years of tradition and faith. Resistance ignites instantly. By the summer of 1978, large swathes of the countryside are in open rebellion. The Afghan army, riddled with tribal loyalties and ideological dissent, begins to crumble. Desertions skyrocket. Units are decimated by mutinies. In Moscow, the Politburo watches with growing alarm. Leonid Brezhnev's Soviet Union is committed to the Brezhnev Doctrine. Once a country goes socialist, it cannot be allowed to revert. Afghanistan, sharing a 1,500-mile border with Soviet Central Asia, is perceived as a crucial buffer state. Its loss to an Islamic insurgency is unthinkable. The situation inside Afghanistan descends into chaos. Taraki is overthrown and murdered in September 1979 by his own deputy Hafizullah Amin. Amin is even more ruthless but no more effective at quelling the rebellion. For the Kremlin, Amin becomes a liability, unpredictable, brutal, and critically, there are whispers he might be seeking openings with the United States to secure his own survival. The Soviet leadership, based on flawed KGB and GRU intelligence, reaches a catastrophic conclusion. Afghanistan is slipping away, and Amin cannot be trusted to hold it. A decisive intervention is required to stabilize the fraternal country, remove Amin, and install a more compliant leader. On December 24, 1979, the intervention begins. It is not framed as an invasion, but as a limited contingent, answering the call of the legitimate Afghan government. At 3:00 p.m. Moscow time, the 40th Army crosses the Amu Darya River on the Friendship Bridge at Termez. The vanguard is the 103rd Guards Airborne Division, flying into Kabul International Airport. Simultaneously, the 5th Guards Motor Rifle Division rolls across the border. Their mission is swift and clinical: secure key infrastructure, neutralize the Afghan Army Command, and assassinate Hafizullah Amin. On December 27th, Spetsnaz units storm the Tajbeg Palace. After a fierce firefight, Amin is dead. The Soviet Union installs Babrak Karmal, an exiled PDPA rival, as the new head of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, DRA. The Kremlin expects the operation to be brief, a show of overwhelming force to install a reliable puppet, secure the cities, and withdraw within months. They have not accounted for the nature of the enemy or the terrain they are committing to. Afghanistan is not the plains of Eastern Europe, where Soviet armoured doctrine was forged. It is a nation of soaring, impassable mountains, deep labyrinthine valleys, and endless deserts. Its road network is primitive, a series of vulnerable choke points. Its population is not a monolithic entity to be pacified, but a kaleidoscope of tribal and ethnic groups for whom resistance to foreign invaders is a centuries-old tradition. The Mujahideen, those who wage jihad, are not a conventional army. They are farmers, shepherds, and shopkeepers by day, and guerrilla fighters by night. Their loyalty is to their village, their valley, and their faith. They have no central command to decapitate, no supply depots to bomb into oblivion. They are the land itself, and they are not alone. Across the Durand Line in Pakistan, President Mohammad Zia-ul-Haq sees a historic opportunity, a chance to bleed the Soviet Union, Pakistan's regional rival, while empowering a Pakistan-friendly Islamic force on its western flank. In Langley, Virginia, President Jimmy Carter's CIA director, Stansfield Turner, receives a directive. Carter signs a presidential finding in early 1980, authorizing covert aid to the Mujahideen. The initial commitment is modest, a few $1 million, funneled through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI. The weapons are old: British Lee Enfield rifles, Chinese copies of the Soviet AK-47, and rocket-propelled grenades. It is a tentative step onto a hidden battlefield. For the Soviet 40th Army, the reality of this new war sets in quickly. The initial sweep and clear operations meet with fleeting success. Tanks and BMPs can control the paved roads by day. But the mountains belong to the Mujahideen. Ambushes are constant, brutal, and efficient. Convoys are strung out along narrow passes, their lead vehicle struck by a mine or RPG, trapping the rest for a slaughter. The Soviet soldier, trained for high-tempo warfare in Europe, finds himself in a grinding counterinsurgency. His enemies are ghosts. They strike from high ground, then melt away into villages where every pair of eyes holds silent hostility. The psychological toll is immense. They call it Ruska Ruletka, Russian roulette. Every journey outside the wire is a spin of the chamber. The Soviet military's initial response to this asymmetric threat was to rely on its overwhelming advantages in firepower and armoured mobility. But this reliance would create a specific, vulnerable pattern, a pattern that would soon be observed, analysed, and exploited from halfway across the world. The Soviet High Command, faced with a stubborn insurgency, turned to the tools of its doctrine: combined arms and technological superiority. The principal instrument of this strategy became the armoured column and its aerial guardian, the helicopter. Soviet motor rifle units mounted in BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicles and supported by T-62 and T-72 tanks would conduct relentless Zakistki, cleansing operations through contested valleys. Their role was to find, fix, and destroy Mujahideen bands. But the guerrillas refused to stand and fight. They adapted, trading territory for survival and turning the Soviet reliance on roads into a lethal vulnerability. This gave birth to the war's most iconic and vulnerable symbol, the supply convoy. Everything the 40th Army needed, from fuel and ammunition to food and mail, had to travel overland from the Soviet Union, down the Salang Highway, through the treacherous gauntlet of the Panjshir, and out to isolated outposts across the country. These convoys, sometimes hundreds of trucks and armoured vehicles long, were colossal, slow-moving targets. The Mujahideen became masters of the ambush. They would block the road with a blown-up vehicle or rock slide, pin the lead and rear vehicles with heavy fire, and then systematically ravage the trapped column from the high ground. It was a tactic as old as warfare, but devastatingly effective in the Afghan topography. To protect these lifelines and assert dominance, the Soviets leveraged their control of the night. In European war planning, night operations were a cornerstone of Soviet tactics designed to overwhelm NATO forces round the clock. In Afghanistan, night became a sanctuary for Soviet forces. The Mujahideen, lacking any form of night vision, were effectively blind after dusk. Soviet patrols and garrisons could breathe slightly easier. Convoy movements often commenced at dusk, using darkness as a cloak. Most critically, the night belonged to the vertolyotchiki, the helicopter pilots. The Mi-24 Hind attack helicopter, a flying armoured vehicle, became the terror of the mountains. 7mm DSHK heavy machine gun. But, at night, equipped with primitive but effective night vision goggles, NVGs, and infrared searchlights, the Hind was transformed. It could hunt supply caravans moving under cover of darkness, stalk Mujahideen camps, and provide devastating close air support for outposts under attack. For the guerrillas, the Shaitan Arbor, the Satan's chariot, was an omnipresent, unstoppable spectre in the dark. This nocturnal imbalance defined the first half of the war. Soviet technological advantage was real, but it was relative. Their tank crews used first-generation active infrared systems, or image intensifiers. The T-62's L2G lunar infrared searchlight, for example, projected an invisible beam that could be seen by any enemy with older-generation IR optics, effectively acting as a beacon. The image intensifiers, like the 1PN22M on the T-62, amplified ambient light, starlight, moonlight, but were useless in complete darkness, such as moonless nights or inside deep shadows. They also bloomed and blinded when faced with a sudden flash like an explosion. This technology gave an edge, but not an insurmountable one. It created a rhythm of war, Soviet dominance by night, cautious movement by day. This rhythm was monitored thousands of miles away. In Washington, the Reagan administration took office in 1981 with a hardened resolve to roll back Soviet influence. The covert war in Afghanistan was no longer a limited holding action. It was a centerpiece of this new, aggressive doctrine. CIA funding ballooned from tens of millions to hundreds of millions annually. The weapon pipelines grew more sophisticated. The initial trickle of small arms gave way to heavy machine guns, mortars, and most significantly, man-portable anti-aircraft weapons. The first major game-changer was the British-made blowpipe, and then the far more effective American FEM-43 Red-Eye, a first-generation heat-seeking missile. It gave the Mujahideen a fleeting chance against low-flying aircraft, but it was a tail-chase weapon, requiring a clear shot at a helicopter's hot exhaust. Skilled Hind pilots learned to evade it with flares and sharp maneuvers. The real intelligence breakthrough came from battlefield analysis. CIA officers and ISI advisors, debriefing Mujahideen commanders and studying after-action reports, identified a critical center of gravity: the Soviet night. The psychological and operational security it provided was a linchpin of the 40th Army's strategy. If that linchpin could be pulled, the entire Soviet edifice would become profoundly unstable. The question was not just what weapon to send, but what capability to deliver. The answer emerged not from a desire for parity, but for supremacy. The Mujahideen didn't just need to see at night, they needed to see better than their enemy. They needed to turn the Soviet sanctuary into a hunting ground. This strategic insight would set in motion a clandestine technological transfer, one that aimed to gift the medieval warrior of the Hindu Kush the eyes of a 21st century soldier. This calculated decision in Washington and Islamabad would manifest on the battlefield not as a single weapon, but as a layered suite of technologies, each designed to dismantle a specific aspect of Soviet armoured and aerial dominance, beginning with the very foundation of mobile warfare, the tank. To understand the shock of the technological shift, one must first inhabit the steel cocoon of a Soviet main battle tank in Afghanistan. It was not the glorious, sweeping instrument of armoured thrust from the Great Patriotic War. It was a mobile, vulnerable fortress, a prison of noise, heat, and relentless tension. A typical T-62 crew consisted of 4 men: the commander, the gunner, the loader, and the driver-mechanic. Their world was defined by a few cubic meters of cramped, oil-scented darkness punctuated by the violent glare of daylight through vision blocks. Their mission profile was grueling and monotonous. Days were spent in static positions, their tank acting as an immobile pillbox overlooking a road or valley mouth. The engine would be switched off to conserve fuel, turning the interior into an oven under the Afghan sun. Dust seeped into everything: their eyes, their food, the delicate mechanisms of the breach. When on the move in a convoy or operation, the experience was one of profound sensory deprivation and acute vulnerability. The driver, peering through a narrow periscope, focused entirely on maintaining distance from the vehicle ahead and avoiding mines or washouts. The commander, his head exposed in the cupola, was a prime target for sniper fire. Every rock, every ditch, every abandoned Kalat wall was a potential ambush point. But it was the night that offered a perverse respite. When the column halted and security perimeters were set, the night vision devices were activated. For the gunner, Senior Sergeant Vasev, the green glow of his 1PN-22M sight was a talisman. It transformed the impenetrable black into a ghostly, shimmering landscape. He could see the heat haze off a distant rock, the silhouette of a wandering donkey, the pale outline of his own sentries. It provided a critical, if fragile, sense of control. He could see. In a war where the enemy was invisible by day, this nocturnal vision felt like a superpower. This confidence was a psychological armor as vital as the tank's rolled steel plating. It allowed for sleep, however fitful. It fostered the belief that they held at least one unchallengeable advantage over the Duki, the spirits as they called the Mujahideen. This mindset was systematically cultivated by their training. Soviet armored doctrine emphasized aggressive night fighting. Their technology, while flawed, was a generation ahead of what any insurgent force was presumed to have. The horror then would not just be tactical, it would be deeply personal and psychological. It would be the moment the green glow of their sight was not just inadequate, but betrayed them. The moment they realized their talisman was obsolete, and the darkness they thought was their ally was, in fact, a perfect cloak for a predator with superior eyes. The ensuing feeling was more than fear. It was a profound professional dissonance, a catastrophic failure of the technological covenant between the soldier and the state that equipped him. The shock experienced by crews like Vasev's was rooted in a fundamental difference in physics. The Soviet systems relied on image intensification. Think of it as a supremely sensitive electronic eye. It collects tiny amounts of ambient light, photons from stars, the moon, even atmospheric glow, and passes them through a photocathode tube, converting them into electrons. These electrons are then accelerated and multiplied through a microchannel plate before striking a phosphor screen, creating a bright, green-hued image of the scene. Its performance is entirely dependent on available light. A moonless, overcast night renders it nearly blind. A bright flash, a muzzle blast, an explosion will white out the tube, leaving the operator dazzled for critical seconds. It sees light, not objects. The technology being funneled to the Mujahideen, primarily the AN-TAS-4 thermal sight, operated on an entirely different principle: infrared thermography. Every object with a temperature above absolute zero emits infrared radiation as heat. A thermal imager is essentially a heat camera. It uses a specialized lens to focus this infrared light from a scene onto a phased array of tiny, sensitive detectors. These detectors create a detailed temperature map, or thermogram, which is then translated into electrical impulses and processed to produce a real-time image on a screen. In this image, contrast is defined by heat differential, not light. A warm engine block glows bright white against the cool, dark blue of the ground. A human being is a vivid thermal signature, even behind light foliage or within a shadow. The implications were revolutionary. A thermal sight does not need any ambient light. It is equally effective in brilliant sunshine, pitch-black night, fog, or light smoke. A tank hiding in a camouflage position, invisible to the naked eye and a starlight scope, would radiate its engine heat through the camouflage netting, presenting a clear, bright signature. A Soviet BMP, its engine compartment at the front, would show up as a blazing white V shape. Most devastatingly, a thermal sight could see through the battlefield obscurance Soviet forces relied on. Smoke grenades, dust clouds kicked up by vehicles, even the pre-dawn mist in the valleys. Soviet smoke was designed to block visible and near-infrared light. It was often transparent to the far infrared wavelengths of thermal images. The technological chasm was not one of degree, but of kind. It was the difference between enhancing the existing visible world and perceiving an entirely separate, invisible layer of reality. This was not a portable system for an infantryman. The AN-TAS-4 was a heavy tripod-mounted unit powered by a bulky battery pack, initially used to guide TOW anti-tank missiles, but its very deployment created a terrifying new dynamic. A Mujahideen crew could set up on a mountainside hours before an ambush, their system passive and emitting no signal. They could watch a Soviet convoy approach from miles away, tracking the distinct heat signatures of tanks versus trucks. They could wait, perfectly patient, for the optimal shot, their crosshairs steady on the hottest part of the target, usually the engine or fuel cells. The first warning the Soviet tank crew would have was the brilliant flash of the missile's launch motor, already in flight. By the time their image intensifiers recovered from the blast, their vehicle was often already dead. The deployment of thermal technology created a terrifying asymmetry, but it was initially confined to static, heavy weapons. The true revolution, the moment the nightmare became omnipresent and personal for every Soviet vehicle commander and helicopter pilot, was when this sight was miniaturized and married to a weapon that could be carried on a man's shoulder. While the TOW missile with its thermal sight threatened Soviet armor, the weapon that truly institutionalized the night vision terror was the FIM-92 Stinger. Introduced to the Afghan battlefield in significant numbers starting in late 1986, the Stinger was a man-portable air defense system, MANPADS. But its true lethality did not come solely from its rocket motor or warhead. It came from its ANAAQ-9 Seeker head, a marvel of miniaturized thermal imaging technology. The Stinger's operation began not with the trigger, but with a click whir and a faint hum. Before launch, the gunner would activate the system's battery coolant unit, BCU. This disposable cartridge screwed into the gripstock contained a tank of argon gas and a thermal battery. When activated, it provided a burst of coolant to freeze the Seeker's infrared detector array to cryogenic temperatures, making it exquisitely sensitive to heat signatures. Simultaneously, it powered up the electronics. The gunner would then raise the weapon to his shoulder, peering into a simple sight. What he saw was not an optical image, but a small glass reticule. The magic happened in the Seeker head at the missile's tip. As the gunner swept the sky, the Stinger's Seeker was listening for a specific infrared signature. It used a rosette scanning pattern, its sensor rapidly spinning to discriminate a target's heat against the background clutter. When it identified a valid signature, the intense, concentrated heat of a helicopter's engine exhaust or a transport plane's turbofan, it sent an audible signal to the gunner's earpiece, a rising, aggressive buzz growl. This was the IFF, identification friend or foe, in its most primal form, the sound of the weapon itself confirming a kill opportunity. The gunner didn't need to see the aircraft with his own eyes. He simply followed the sound, letting the growl reach its peak pitch as he aligned the reticule and squeezed the trigger. The missile's launch was relatively gentle, a low-pressure ejection motor kicking it about 30 feet from the tube before the main solid rocket motor ignited with a whoosh. 2. Crucially, it was a fire-and-forget weapon. Once launched, it needed no further guidance from the gunner, who could immediately relocate. The Seeker in the missile's nose, now guiding itself, was not fooled by simple flares. It used an advanced proportional navigation system and, in later models, a dual-mode Seeker, IR-UV, that could distinguish between the ultraviolet signature of a jet's exhaust plume and the different chemical makeup of a decoy flare. For the Soviet helicopter pilot, this changed everything. His old tactics, flying nap of the earth, using terrain masking, popping up to fire and diving away, were nullified. The Stinger team could be anywhere, on a ridgeline he hadn't scanned, in a village he thought was friendly, hidden in the shadow of a rock where his own NVGs saw nothing. The first warning was often the missile's smoke trail already arcing toward him. The growl in the Mujahid's ear was the death knell for Soviet aerial omnipotence. The introduction of thermal optics and the Stinger did not automatically grant victory. It required a profound adaptation from the Mujahideen fighter, transforming him from a traditional guerrilla into a disciplined technical operator. This transformation was orchestrated by Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, and CIA paramilitary officers. The training pipeline was rigorous and secret. Selected fighters, often younger, more literate men, were taken to remote camps in Pakistan. Here, the mystique of the weapon was stripped away, replaced by rote procedure. Training on the TOW and later the Stinger was methodical and safety-obsessed. Instructors used cutaway models, video simulators, and repetitive drills. Trainees spent hours sweeping dummy aircraft tracks, learning to trust the audio cue over their own eyes. Maintenance was drilled relentlessly. checking battery coolant unit dates, inspecting seeker heads for damage, and following strict firing protocols. The ISI ensured that the distribution of these systems was tightly controlled, given only to trusted, ideologically vetted commanders to prevent them from falling into hands that might turn them against Pakistan or its interests. On the battlefield, the tactical shift was dramatic. Stinger and TOW teams operated as elite hunter-killer groups, separate from the main force. They prized patience and positioning over bravado. A Stinger team tasked with protecting a Mujahideen supply caravan would set up in overlapping positions on high ground hours before the caravan's movement. They would not engage the first Hind they saw. They would wait for the optimal shot, when the helicopter was slow, low, and committed to an attack run. Discipline was paramount. A single wasted missile was a catastrophic loss. The psychological impact on these fighters was immense. The Stinger, in particular, was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of divine favour and technological parity. They called it the Farah, joy or happiness. To hear the growl, to see the missile streak upwards and the Satan's chariot blossom into fire was a transcendent moment. It shattered the myth of Soviet invincibility and vindicated their struggle. They were no longer just peasants with rifles. They were the equals of a superpower, equipped with its most secret technology. This newfound confidence altered their entire operational posture. They began to move larger forces by day, knowing their thermal-equipped scouts could spot Soviet ambushes from afar. They grew more aggressive in besieging outposts, confident that Stinger screens could blunt the aerial resupply and close air support the garrisons depended on. The Soviet soldier now faced an enemy who was not only fearless but could see him with inhuman clarity. The darkness, the dust, the mountain mist, all were now allies of the guerrilla. The technological asymmetry had not been leveled, it had been inverted. This inversion reached its logical, terrifying conclusion, not in isolated ambushes, but in the systematic unravelling of a fundamental Soviet combat operation, the relief of a besieged outpost. It was here, in the desperate mechanics of a failed breakthrough, that the horror of the new night would be seared into the memory of the 40th Army. To understand the turning point, we must focus not on a single cataclysmic battle, but on a pervasive tactical reality that became unsustainable: the Soviet outpost and its inevitable relief column. The scenario played out countless times across Afghanistan from 1986 onward, but one stark example encapsulates the totality of the shift. The outpost at Gorban Pass, Wardak Province, March 1987. The outpost is a bleak, earthen-walled fortification clinging to a mountainside, overlooking a critical stretch of highway. It houses a platoon of Soviet motor riflemen and a detachment of Afghan government soldiers. For weeks it has been under loose siege by a large group of Mujahideen from the local Jamiat-e-Islami faction. Soviet intelligence, gleaned from intercepted radio traffic and aerial reconnaissance, indicates a major assault is imminent. The outpost's commander requests an emergency resupply and reinforcement. The 40th Army Command, based in Kabul, approves a relief operation. The plan is standard Soviet doctrine. A powerful, armoured column, Haute Triad, will battle its way from the main base to the outpost, break the siege, deliver supplies and fresh troops, and return. The column assembled for Operation Vizariv, Explosion, is formidable. 6 T-62 tanks, 10 BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles, and a dozen BTR-70 armoured personnel carriers, carrying a company of motor riflemen. Supporting them are 2 batteries of 2S-1 Gvozdika self-propelled howitzers for indirect fire and, most crucially, a flight of 4 Mi-24D Hinds from the 335th Separate Combat Helicopter Regiment, tasked with aerial escort and reconnaissance. The column commander, Major Igor Drozdenko, briefs his officers the night before. His plan leverages their traditional advantages. They will move out at 04:30 hours in the pre-dawn darkness. The Hinds, using their night vision systems, will fly ahead, scouting the route for ambushes. The tanks, with their image intensifiers, will lead the ground column, their guns scanning the high ground. Speed and violence of action are key. They expect the usual harassment: sporadic RPG fire from the ridges, perhaps a DSHK machine gun. They are prepared for it. What they are not prepared for is the orchestrated, multi-layered killing zone that awaits. The local Mujahideen commander, Abdul Rahim, a veteran of a dozen major engagements, had received a special delivery 2 weeks prior. His group now possessed one AN TAS-4 tow system and, more importantly, 3 Stinger missiles with 2 trained teams. His scouts, observing Soviet patrol patterns from miles away with older generation American night vision scopes, had accurately predicted the relief route. Rahim did not plan to stop the column at a single point. He planned to dismantle it piece by piece from the sky down. His forces were deployed in 3 layers. 1, the sky cleavers. 2 Stinger teams were positioned on opposing peaks 3 kilometers apart, covering the air corridor the Hinds would use. 2, the tank killers. The 2W team was sighted on a reverse slope overlooking a narrow defile where the road switchbacked, a choke point the tanks would have to slow to navigate. 3, the grinders. Dozens of RPG-7 gunners and machine gunners, hidden in fortified positions along a 1-kilometer stretch past the defile, were tasked with engaging the infantry and soft-skinned vehicles once the column's leadership and air cover were destroyed. Their greatest asset was not the weapons, but the information. Rahim, positioned at an observation post with a powerful thermal spotting scope loaned by his ISI advisor, could watch the entire Soviet assembly area at the base, some 15 kilometers away. He saw the heat blooms of tank engines starting up. He saw the brighter, smaller signatures of the Hinds on their pads. The Soviet night movement was no longer secret. It was a televised parade of thermal signatures. The execution. Dawn in a new world, 04:45 hours. The Soviet column is on the move, a roaring serpent of steel and diesel fumes winding up the pass. In the lead tank, Gunner Vasev's world is a green, bouncing haze. He sees the road, the rocks, nothing else. In the sky, the 2 lead Hinds, call signs Bort 025 and 026, sweep ahead at 100 meters altitude. Pilot Captain Viktor Gorshkov in 025 scans the ridges with his NSPU-24 night vision goggles. The terrain is a monochrome blur of shadows. He sees no muzzle flashes, no troop movements. On the eastern peak, Stinger gunner Mohammed Zahir hears the distant thump, thump, thump of rotors first. He raises his weapon, points it in the direction of the sound, and activates the BCU. A sharp hiss, then the system hums to life. He sweeps the sky. In his earpiece, silence, then a faint, fluctuating warble. He steadies the tube, the growl sharpening, rising in pitch as the unseen helicopter's infrared signature strengthens. He doesn't see the Hind. He follows the sound of its heat. The growl becomes a sustained, piercing snarl. He aligns the reticule and fires. From Gorshkov's cockpit, the first indication is his wingman's frantic shout over the radio. 025, missile launch. He banks hard, instinctively releasing flares. A fiery streak crosses his vision. The missile ignores the decoys. It strikes Bort 026 just forward of the engine exhaust. The Hind disintegrates in a silent orange flash visible for miles. Gorshkov's NVGs flare white, blinding him. As he struggles to regain control and sight, a second growl from the western peak locks onto his own aircraft. He never hears the launch. The warhead detonates against his tailboom, severing the controls. His Hind spins into the mountainside. On the ground, Major Drozdenko hears the double explosion and sees the fireballs in the sky. His air cover is gone, less than 3 minutes into the engagement. He barks orders to accelerate, to push through the defile before the ambush is fully sprung. His lead tanks throttle up. As the first T-62 enters the narrowest part of the pass, its commander scanning the empty rocks with his intensifier, the TOW gunner 2 kilometers away sees its engine compartment as a brilliant white rectangle on his screen. The crosshairs settle. The missile launches, its wire guidance spooling out unseen. The TOW missile's flight time is just over 10 seconds. For the commander of the lead T-62, Lieutenant Pavel Antipov, the first warning is a brief, flickering streak in his peripheral vision, like a shooting star on the ground. Before his brain can process it as a threat, the world explodes. The missile strikes the tank just below the turret ring on the left side, penetrating the thin armor with its shaped charge jet. The internal overpressure is catastrophic. The hatches blow open, vomiting a plume of fire and smoke. The tank shudders to a halt, its treads broken, a burning hulk that now blocks 70% of the narrow road. Inside the second tank, Vasev's green-lit sight is flooded with the blinding white fireball. He instinctively flinches back, his night vision obliterated. He hears the frantic voice of his commander, "Reverse!" But behind them, the column is compressing, the third and fourth vehicles piling up against one another. Major Drozdenko, in his command BMP near the centre of the column, is now fighting a battle of fragments. He orders his artillery support to saturate the ridge where the TOW signature was spotted. The two S-1 howitzers begin firing, their shells screaming overhead. But the TOW team has already executed its drill. The launcher is broken down and the three-man crew is scrambling up a pre-planned escape route to a secondary position. The artillery shells crater empty rock. Now, the third layer of the ambush ignites. With the column trapped, its leadership decapitated, and its air support gone, Abdul Rahim gives the signal. From concealed positions along the high ground, a storm of fire descends. This is not the sporadic potshots of a traditional ambush. It is a coordinated, concentrated barrage from multiple heavy machine guns and RPG-7s. The Soviet infantry, dismounting from their BMPs and BTRs to try and establish a perimeter, are caught in the open. Their own night vision goggles are useless against enemies who are not moving, whose positions show no muzzle flash in the visible spectrum, but whose weapons fire from the thermal shadows. The Soviet return fire is wild, undisciplined. Tank guns and BMP autocannons fire at suspected positions, tracers arcing into the dark, but they are aiming at ghosts. They have no thermal signature to target. A BTR-70, its commander trying to maneuver off the road to create space, rolls over a landmine, its heat signature having been marked hours earlier by a Mujahideen scout. The explosion tears off a front wheel and it slews sideways, further compounding the traffic jam. The horror for the Soviet soldier is now complete and multisensory. He is deafened by the roar of his own guns and the explosions around him. He is blind to the source of the enemy fire. He is trapped in a valley that has become a shooting gallery, with the high ground owned by an enemy who sees him as clearly as if it were noon. The psychological core of the Soviet soldier, the belief in the systemic superiority of his equipment, shatters in real time. The technology has betrayed them. Their night is no longer a shield. It is a curtain behind which their deaths are being arranged. The retreat, a broken doctrine. After 45 minutes of one-sided slaughter, Major Drozdenko makes the only possible decision. He calls in a smokescreen and orders a general retreat. White phosphorus shells burst over the killing zone, creating a thick, billowing cloud designed to block line of sight. To the Soviet tankers and infantry, it offers a fleeting moment of relief. They begin the painstaking process of extracting the wrecked vehicles, pushing the destroyed T-62 off the road with another tank, and turning the entire column around under continuous, harassing fire. But for Abdul Rahim, watching through his thermal spotter, the smoke is a translucent fog. He can still see the bright, hot shapes of the engines, the exhaust pipes, the personnel huddled behind vehicles. The retreat does not become an orderly withdrawal. It becomes a running engagement. The Mujahideen, emboldened, move parallel to the road, continuing to snipe at the column with RPGs and machine guns from new positions. They are no longer afraid of the hinds. They are hunters driving wounded prey. The remnants of Operation Vizriv limp back into their base just after dawn. The cost is staggering. 2 Mi-24 helicopters destroyed with all crew lost, 1 T-62 and 2 BTRs destroyed, 3 more BMPs severely damaged, and 27 soldiers dead, with over 40 wounded. They have failed to reach the outpost. The siege continues. News of the debacle radiates through the 40th Army Command within hours. The implications are clear. This was not a defeat born of cowardice or poor training. It was a systemic, technological defeat. The methods that had underpinned Soviet combined arms operations in Afghanistan for 7 years, the night move, the armoured relief column, the helicopter escort, were now obsolete. The turning point is not a single battle, but the crystallization of a new, unbearable reality. For Soviet commanders, every night movement, every convoy, every close air support mission now carried an incalculable risk. The initiative, firmly held since 1979, begins to drain away. The confidence of the rank and file erodes, replaced by a pervasive, demoralizing anxiety. The night, once a time for rest and resupply, becomes a time of acute vulnerability. The technological horror was no longer a rumour or an isolated incident. It was the new doctrine of the war. The failed relief of Gorband was a microcosm of a systemic collapse that rippled across the entire theatre of operations. The immediate, bloody aftermath on the ground would soon be followed by strategic recalculations in Moscow and Washington, as both superpowers grasped the full consequences of this nocturnal revolution. The aftermath of engagements like the Gorband ambush was not confined to the repair yards or the field hospitals. It reverberated through the central nervous system of the 40th Army, triggering a cascade of operational, tactical, and psychological changes that fundamentally altered the character of the war. Operational paralysis. The most immediate effect was a sharp contraction in Soviet mobility and offensive action. Regimental and divisional commanders, faced with mounting losses in previously routine operations, became profoundly risk-averse. Large-scale Zakistki operations requiring long-distance movement of armoured columns became increasingly rare and were planned with obsessive, often paralysing caution. The default posture shifted from active counterinsurgency to static defence of key urban centres, air bases and major highways. The initiative was ceded almost entirely to the Mujahideen. They now dictated the time, place and intensity of engagements. Convoy schedules were shuffled constantly, routes were altered at the last minute, and movement without massive preparatory artillery barrages became unthinkable. The logistics of the war, always a strain, became a nightmare of delay and inefficiency. The death of the night offensive. The concept of the night as a Soviet domain was formally abandoned. Night patrols outside of immediate perimeter defenses were drastically reduced. The iconic image of the Hind as a nocturnal predator vanished. Helicopter operations were severely curtailed after dusk and were often restricted to emergency medevac missions flown at extreme risk. Pilots developed a condition they called Stinger syndrome, a constant, neck-craning anxiety, scanning not for ground fire but for the telltale smoke trail of a missile launch from any patch of terrain. Flight profiles changed, helicopters flew higher, faster, and avoided predictable patterns, but this made them less effective for close support and reconnaissance. The very tool designed to provide flexibility and rapid response had been hobbled. Psychological morale. Collapse. The technological shock translated into a deep and corrosive morale crisis. For the Soviet soldier, faith in his equipment was a cornerstone of his identity. The T-72 tank, the Mi-24 helicopter, these were symbols of national power and engineering prowess. To witness them being destroyed by an unseen enemy, with weapons that seemed to operate by magic, was profoundly demoralizing. A new vocabulary of dread entered the soldiers' slang. They spoke of the Greben, the growl of the Stinger, a sound many heard only in the seconds before their helicopter was hit. They whispered about the Amerikanskie Gläser, American eyes that could see through darkness and smoke. The feeling was one of profound unfairness, a sense that they were fighting not just Afghans, but the entire technological might of the West, naked and exposed. Desertion rates among Afghan army troops soared, but now a trickle of Soviet soldiers too began to seek ways to avoid duty, with non-combat losses from accidents and self-inflicted wounds showing a marked increase. The Afghan army unravelling. The DRA forces, always unreliable, now became an active liability. Witnessing the invincible Soviet patron being humbled shattered whatever residual confidence they had. Defections to the Mujahideen, often with entire units and their Soviet-issued equipment, became commonplace. This forced the 40th Army to allocate even more troops to guard duty, watching their supposed allies and to conduct ever more dangerous convoy operations to prop up isolated garrisons that were often on the verge of surrender or mutiny. The war effort was bifurcating. The Soviets were fighting to hold their own perimeter, while the civil war they were supposed to be mediating collapsed entirely around them. The tactical whiplash. Soviet forces scrambled to adapt, but their solutions were improvised and often inadequate. They began welding makeshift steel gratings, reshetki, onto tanks and APCs to serve as standoff armour against shaped charge warheads, creating the iconic cage-like appearance of late-war Soviet vehicles. They increased the use of artillery and scatterable mines to create defensive zones. They tried to develop counter-tactics against Stingers, using paired helicopters where one would act as bait to draw a missile launch while the other would engage the revealed position. But these were reactive, defensive measures. They did not restore the offensive capability that had been lost. The technological gap could not be bridged by field expedients. It required a systemic response from the Soviet military-industrial complex, a response that would be too little and far too late. The battlefield reality had shifted irrevocably, but the flow of the very technology that caused this shift was accelerating. In Washington and Islamabad, the success of the thermal and Stinger programs was being analysed not as an endpoint, but as the beginning of a final, decisive push. The battlefield trauma inflicted by thermal optics and Stingers was a symptom of a deeper strategic victory for the covert coalition backing the Mujahideen. In Langley and at ISI headquarters in Islamabad, the reports from Afghanistan validated a colossal gamble. The technological infusion had achieved its primary objective. It had dramatically raised the political, economic, and human cost of the Soviet occupation to unsustainable levels. The metrics of attrition, Soviet losses, which had been a steady, grim drumbeat, became a rising cacophony. Official figures remain contested, but the period from 1986 to 1988 shows a sharp spike in aircraft and helicopter losses. According to declassified CIA assessments and Soviet veterans' accounts, the Stinger is credited with downing an average of 1 aircraft per day in the first year of its widespread deployment. The psychological impact translated into hard economics. Replacing a single Mi-24 Hind cost millions of rubles and months of factory production. The loss of experienced pilots who took years to train was an even greater blow. The war's annual cost to the Soviet economy ballooned, estimated at several $1 billion a year, a catastrophic drain on a stagnating, centrally planned system already straining under the weight of the Cold War arms race with Reagan's military buildup. The Politburo's reckoning. This escalated cost coincided with a seismic shift in Moscow's leadership. Mikhail Gorbachev had come to power in 1985 with the mantras of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. The war in Afghanistan was the antithesis of these principles. It was a hidden, corrupting, endless drain. The Politburo, once united in its commitment to the Brezhnev Doctrine, was now fractured. The old guard argued for one final, overwhelming offensive. The reformers, led by Gorbachev and Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze, saw only a quagmire that was poisoning East-West relations, crippling the economy, and demoralizing the Soviet people. The technological shock on the battlefield provided the military justification the reformers needed. It proved that the war could not be won with conventional military means, no matter how many troops were committed. The argument shifted from how to win to how to exit. The Geneva Accords and the withdrawal, the decision to withdraw, taken in principle in late 1987, became public strategy. The USSR sought a face-saving political solution, negotiated through the United Nations. The Geneva Accords, signed in April 1988, mandated the withdrawal of Soviet forces. The subsequent pullout, conducted in 2 phases from May 1988 to February 1989, was itself a testament to the Mujahideen's newfound power. The retreating columns were harried constantly, but the Mujahideen, under pressure from their Pakistani and American handlers to not humiliate the Soviets too severely and risk a brutal reintervention, largely allowed the exit to proceed. The final iconic images, the last BMD rolling back across the Friendship Bridge at Termez, the young Colonel General Boris Gromov declaring he was the last Soviet soldier to leave, masked the reality of a defeated, exhausted army. Blowback and the unravelling. The aftermath, however, was not a clean victory. The Stinger missile, Bertmars in particular, created a lasting headache for its American creators. The CIA launched an urgent multi-million-dollar buyback program, Operation MIAS, to recover the hundreds of missiles left in the region, fearing they would proliferate to terrorist groups. Many were never recovered. The expertise and confidence gained by the Mujahideen and the international network of jihadists that fought alongside them would not be contained. The war had forged a hardened, globally minded Islamic militant movement. The weapons, the tactics, and the ideology bled out from Afghanistan, destabilizing the region and beyond. The very success of the covert operation helped sow the seeds for future conflicts. For the Soviet Union, the consequences were existential. The Afghan war laid bare the rot within the system, the corruption, the inefficiency, the gap between propaganda and reality. The returning veterans, the Afghansi, were often shunned and disillusioned, a living testament to the state's failure. The humiliation in Afghanistan critically undermined the authority of the Communist Party and the Red Army, 2 pillars of the Soviet state. It accelerated the internal collapse that would culminate in the dissolution of the USSR in 1991. The bleeding wound had, in the end, fatally weakened the patient. The last Soviet soldier had departed, but the night vision genie could not be put back in the bottle. The technological and tactical lessons of the Afghan mountains would ripple out, reshaping the very nature of warfare and redefining the meaning of darkness on the battlefield for decades to come. The echo of a stinger's growl in the thin air of the Hindu Kush was more than the death knell for a helicopter. It was the sound of a threshold being crossed. The Soviet-Afghan War, in its final, decisive phase, ceased to be a purely ideological or territorial struggle. It became a laboratory for a new kind of combat, one where microchip and sensor began to matter as much as mass and firepower. The tanker's horror in his green-lit cocoon was the human reaction to a fundamental shift in the physics of the battlefield, the demystification of darkness. For millennia, night had been a universal solvent of military power, a great equalizer that favoured the guerrilla, the defender, the stealthy. It provided respite, concealment, the opportunity for retreat or regrouping. The introduction of image intensification had begun to tilt this balance, granting a temporary technical advantage to the conventional force. But the deployment of thermal imaging reversed the polarity entirely. It transformed darkness from an opaque blanket into a transparent medium for the technologically endowed. The side with thermal vision did not merely see in the dark, they saw through it, rendering the traditional cover of night obsolete. In Afghanistan, this meant the difference between a vulnerable convoy and a secure one, between a dominant helicopter and a flying coffin, between holding an outpost and being besieged within it. The war's legacy, therefore, is etched in silicon and policy. It proved the devastating effectiveness of precision-guided, technology-enabled asymmetry in modern conflict. A handful of men with a system that saw heat could paralyze a division reliant on systems that saw light. This lesson was absorbed in war colleges from Fort Leavenworth to Sandhurst. It directly informed the Revolution in Military Affairs, RMA, that would define the following decades, culminating in the sensor-rich, night-capable dominance of Western forces in the Gulf War, just 2 years after the Soviet withdrawal. The night vision gap witnessed in Afghanistan became a chasm that defined future battlefields, making nighttime the preferred time of operation for the technologically advanced. Yet the closure of this chapter carries a profound and enduring irony. The very technology that helped break a superpower did not secure a lasting peace. It flowed into a volatile ecosystem of conflict, empowering non-state actors and altering the global security calculus in unpredictable ways. The victory in Afghanistan was a tactical masterpiece of covert action, but its strategic aftermath was a chaotic, unintended blowback. The war ended not with a stable peace, but with a void. A shattered nation and an empowered, radicalized legacy that would soon turn its gaze elsewhere. In the end, the story of the Soviet tanker and the American thermal sight is a cautionary tale about the double-edged nature of technological supremacy. It is a reminder that in war, every solution begets a new vulnerability, every conquered frontier reveals another, and the ultimate cost of seeing in the dark is the illumination of one's own unforeseen weaknesses. The mountains of Afghanistan taught the world that the night could be conquered. The decades that followed would reveal the price of that conquest.